Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, today with a video going over this Chen Grand Marshal Ming. Now, this is not my sword. It is on loan to me from Chen, along with several other swords from them. And for this review, this isn't actually a review. This is an impressions video. I'm not doing a full review on this because, like the other swords that were in this batch, they've all been shipped around quite a bit, and shipping is not particularly forgiving to swords. This one has some flaws from the amount of shipping it's been through. There's a crack in the guard or in the grip, and then the guard is a little bit loose. So I'm not doing a full review, but I do want to give you my thoughts on this sword. And what you should know about this sword in this configuration is $405 from Chen plus $70 shipping to the US. You can get a slightly cheaper version made of spring steel rather than the pattern welding on here for $375 plus the $70 shipping. So we're looking at $450 to close to $500 for this sword. So as you can see, it does come with the scabbard with a decent amount of brass or bronze decoration and 2 mounting points to put it on a belt. The fit is quite good. You might hear that, you might not. That's the guard slightly shaking, not the fit of the sword to the scabbard. It's actually a good fit. If I hold it upside down, doesn't come out. A little bit of shaking, still doesn't come out. Good fit. If I pull it out, very easy to draw it, and it's got a nice smooth fit all the way in. It's a nice scabbard. I do like it. It's also pretty hefty with this amount of metal on it. There's a good amount of weight in the scabbard as well as in the blade, and you could use this. Feels like you could use it as a weapon. You could probably hold this in your offhand and maybe block, especially with like the chape here, or smash somebody with it. But the sword is the real star of the show here, and obviously the hilt is pretty eye-catching. The guard and pommel, if you want to call it that, are these large blocks of, I'm assuming they're brass. They look like brass to me. Now, they're not solid blocks. The guard, you can see, is actually hollow within. If this were a solid block, this thing would be massively heavy. As is, it weighs 2 pounds, 7 ounces. If this were solid, and the pommel doesn't feel solid either. I'm sure this is more of like a hollow pommel. If those were solid, this thing would weigh multiple pounds more. As is, 2 pounds, 7 ounces, that's a pretty reasonable weight for a one-handed sword. It is a fairly short blade. I don't have the measurements here, but you can see the hilt takes up a little bit more of the overall length than I would typically expect on a sword. But it does work on here. Now, it's balanced pretty close to the guard. In fact, it's just barely past the guard. Again, there's a lot of metal in the hilt, a lot of weight in the hilt. And the blade is pretty stiff. Has a little bit of flex out towards the end, but not a whole lot. It is very lively because it has that very close point of balance. So it's very easy to accelerate the tip and get this sword moving. Now, when I'm doing this, I'm a little bit more cautious than normal because the guard is a little bit loose. So that weakens my grip on the sword. I could move down here and grip the guard a little bit less, and it works. It does feel a little clunkier like that, though. I definitely prefer to grip it right up there. Theoretically, you could get 2 hands on this, but this is a pretty short blade. It's already very nimble. It does not need a second hand at all. I would not want to put a second hand on here. If I do this, it just doesn't feel right. It's already so nimble in one hand, it doesn't need that second hand. The grip shape is very good. You can see I'm trying to twist, can't do it. This is locked into my hand very well. And these little decorative rivets, I don't know what to call that, but the little decorations on here, while they do stick out from the grip, where I end up gripping it, they don't bother my hand at all. The guard here, it does stick out a little bit too, and it can bother the hand right in here a little bit, but it really didn't give me that much problem because my hand doesn't move when I'm using this grip. It's really locked in well. If my hand was sliding around a little bit more, or the sword was sliding around in my hand a little bit more, I think that would be more uncomfortable. But because it isn't, even with the guard a little bit loose, no hot spots at all. So overall, like I said, it's a very striking hilt with multiple bits of decoration like these cutouts here, the rivet there. There's I would assume you'd put like a tassel or something like this through here, and there's some decorative carvings there. Overall, it's a really pretty sword. The blade is made of their pattern welded steel, and it's pretty simple actually. It's got just a tiny bit of profile taper, a pretty rounded tip, has a lot of distal taper, and a little bit of rippling on the blade, but not a whole lot. Now, like I said, this is one of many of the swords that LK Chen sent me. I think it was 7 or 8, with one of those being 2 of the same model. So one less model than that would count. But this is one of my favorite. In fact, this is probably my favorite that they sent me. I love the way it moves around. It's very nimble, very easy to start the cut, but then also to stop right where I want it to be. The tip, very nimble. I can get it right where I want it to, the tip right where I want it to go. It's easy to accelerate the tip and then continue cuts, do a second cut, all that stuff. Very easy to move around and very fun to move around as well. Now, as always with these LK Chen videos, I'm going to introduce my friend Andy from Delotrix to talk a little bit more about the history of this sword, what led to its development. So take it away, Andy.
Thanks again, Kyle, so much for having me on. So today we're looking at the Ming Jian, the Grand Marshal Jian from LK Chen. So this is coming at a time when China has just suffered almost 100 years of occupation under the Mongols. So the previous Yuan dynasty had suffered basically an economic collapse, having lost hyperinflation with their currency and suffered natural disasters like earthquake. And eventually a national uprising occurred, and the foundation of the start of the Ming dynasty occurred in the middle of the 14th century. So in 1368, the Ming dynasty started, and it lasted for about 300 years. And it is seen as a time of great solidifying of Chinese culture, great preservation of many of the Chinese arts and cultural heritage. This was a time when China protected its borders, built the Great Wall. It did suffer some issues with piracy because they took a lot of funds that had previously been allocated to the Navy, and so they lost some territorial control over the waters during this time. But it's a kind of interesting time when their military might was still on display. And so this is the time that this sword is coming out of. And so it's interesting that in many ways is kind of the opposite of this sword that I have here. So this is the Yuan style saber, so the Mongol style saber that came from the dynasty before it. And this was the side weapon of the infantry. And you may remember from previous videos that after the Han Dynasty, the military sidearm of most troopers, so most soldiers in the Chinese military, switched from being a Jian rather, so a double-edged sword, to a single-edged dao of some type, whether it's straight or curved or big-bellied or kind of narrow. It's always been a dao, and that continued through the Mongol period. So after the Mongols came in, the steppe people who specialized in horseback warfare, their particular dao tended to be relatively curved. And that trend continues through the Ming period. Ming sabers tend to be reasonably curvy in their configuration. So where does this Jian fit in? This Jian is not a trooper's example, but unlike this example here that we see from the Qing dynasty, this is a double-edged Jian that would be seen comfortably on perhaps, you know, a well-to-do gentleman who might be wearing a sword just to go about town or visit a tea house or what have you. The example that we're looking at today is very specifically meant to replicate an antique that they suspect would be used by a high-ranking military official. The name Jian, so Tidu is a high-ranking military officer, and Jian means war, so Jian is war sword. So rather than just a kind of any type of sword, maybe that could be used by a civilian or anyone who's wealthy enough to be able to afford a sword and go around town, this sword, the Grand Marshal, is very specifically intended to be used by high-ranking military officials. So Jian were still in the military. Usually they were not issued weapons. So these were kind of specialty weapons, what we might think of as officer swords. So if you were a high-ranking, a governor-appointed person, someone who was overseeing a large contingent of men, you might wear a very impressive jian of many different configurations. And we'll go into the hilt in a second. So this sword, even though it looks like it's very impressive, is still able to do damage. It's still perfectly serviceable as a weapon. Would it have seen action on the battlefield? Perhaps, perhaps not. There was a painting that I reviewed recently that showed the Ming military engaging with pirates, and there are a couple of troopers at the front of the painting that look like they may have jian with long crosses on the front of them. Those may actually be bar maces instead of jian. But it seems like jian in general during the Ming period are much reduced and not as common as dao. So this particular jian that we're looking at, the Grand Marshal, was a sword for a man of high import. It was still a completely valid weapon. It could be used. Was it used on the battlefield to engage an enemy? Probably only as a weapon of last resort, as something to protect the owner in case the owner found himself in a very tight spot. But it was still a perfectly usable weapon, perfectly serviceable weapon that would be carried on his person to show his status to anyone who questioned who this captain, this general, this marshal, this lieutenant was when he was on the battlefield. It has a 2-point suspension method on the side of it, and it has very ornate fittings. So during this period, the jian have some of the most varied types of designs we see, especially around the hilt. You can find all sorts of different configurations. You can find crescents, you can find discards, you can find ones that have all sorts of long types of quillons on them. This particular example that they've gone for has Taoist significance. So there is a kind of floral convention or floral motif on the brass cutouts and the elements on both the scabbard and on the hilt elements. The pommel is shaped like a gourd leaf, which in Chinese is a huluye. And the hilt, the crossguard, which has these very wide sort of brass but kind of flat and soft round shapes, is imitative of a type of fungus, which is called the lingzhi fungus. Both of these have Taoist significance. So they're ergonomic in that they make the hilt very comfortable and easy to use, but they also have significance to the religion being practiced at the time. So together, they make for a very hefty sword. This is not a light, nimble, dueling sword from the Han or the later Qing. This is a substantial sword that feels almost like a medieval arming sword when carried, but it's still very comfortable in the hand. You can see from the dynamics that it'll balance very close to the grip and is very easy to manipulate. It has a broad, stiff blade, so it can deliver fierce cuts and good thrusts. But I'll let Kyle get into how the blade performs. So back to you, Kyle.
As always, thank you for your contribution, Andy. For my viewers, check out his channel. It's linked in the description, Delatrix Swords. If you haven't, make sure you subscribe. He puts out a lot of really cool sword content. So when I took this sword into the backyard to do some cutting, I didn't expect that much out of it, mostly because of this kind of loose guard. I didn't feel like I wasn't particularly confident in moving it around. You can probably hear that. It's definitely a little bit loose, but I decided I wanted to give it a try. I am glad I did. This sword is fun to cut with. It's very sharp. I believe it's actually been sharpened by, I think, Philip Martin, so that explains why it's very sharp. But it is just a joy to move around, to cut targets with. I did some moulinets. I know that's not the term in Chinese Jianfa, but that's how I know it. You know, I was mostly going with elbow moulinets rather than just wrist moulinets. But regardless, this is something I have almost no practice with, and I was able to get some decent cuts doing that. That's a testament to, you know, the sword's stiffness, the sharpness, but also just how easy it is to move around. It was very simple to get these cuts moving and the tip accelerated and get everything working. And it was just a joy to cut with. It was that, and that's one of the things I love about going out in the backyard and doing cutting, is when you find a sword that just is fun to cut with. Not every sword is fun to cut with. Some of them are a challenge, which can be a good thing. You know, a sword's a challenge to cut with. You really have to focus on your technique. It may be good for training yourself to focus on the technique. But man, there is something so fun about finding a sword that just sings through targets easily and just lets you have a good time. This sword did that for me very much. So yeah, I really like this sword. Like I said, this is probably my favorite of the LK Chen swords. I don't know which is my favorite between this one and the next one I'm going to be doing a video on, but I really, really like this. And $475 is how much this costs, including shipping. I do think it's worth that price, and it's one I'm very tempted to buy myself. I'm actually keeping an eye out for a secondhand market. Maybe I can find one there for a little bit less, but I very well might want to buy one of these at that full price just because it's a lot of fun to use and swing. I really enjoy it. And if I really enjoy a sword in the backyard, that's one of my primary goals in collecting, is finding swords I enjoy using. So this fits in that very, very well. And that's going to wrap up this quick look at the LK Chen Grand Marshal Ming Jian. I hope it is informative. Maybe you will want to pick one of these up. But in any case, I want to say thank you to my friend Andy for his contributions. Thank you to LK Chen for sending me these swords to do these videos on. Until next time, Alien Toot out.